Hi class, and welcome to the last lecture for the course. Yay, right? Today we're going to talk about standardized tests. We're going to be discussing specifically what are some standardized tests and how are they used, what types of standardized tests are given, how are they interpreted, what are some issues concerning standardized testing, and how are you as educators going to be held accountable for student achievement. First of all, let's talk about what are standardized tests and how are they used. Most people know the term standardized testing, and a lot of people have negative associations. But in this lecture, you'll see that they actually have a number of positives. Otherwise, they wouldn't have existed for as long as they have. The reason that standardized tests exist is because they are uniform in content and administration and scoring. So a standardized test allows the same test to be given to a lot of different people and measure the same content. So we know how students, for example, across states do. They're given directions for how to administer them. And so, that can sometimes, if you're not careful, get in the way of test results. But by providing standardization and how they're administered, hopefully you get over some of those issues. And scoring. So these tests have been um, piloted on hundreds of thousands of people frequently, and so they've worked out all the kinks in scoring. As a consequence, standardized tests allow for comparison of results across classrooms, across schools, and across school districts. What are some of the reasons we use standardized tests? Well, sometimes they're used to select students for entry or placement in specific programs. So for example, the SAT is a big standardized test that's used to screen students for college entrance. You might have IQ or other types of standardized tests that screen students for special programs such as gifted and talented. Or you might have diagnostic tests that focus on students with disabilities and screen them for special ed programs. High school students may use standardized tests in deciding which students, high school counselors may use standardized tests in deciding which students to counsel to, for example, college preparatory courses, or which ones to put in general or vocational programs. As we mentioned previously, sometimes standardized tests are used for diagnostic purposes to diagnose individual students' learning problems or strengths. For example, a student who is performing poorly might be given a battery of tests to determine whether he or she has a learning disability. These sophisticated assessments can help you determine students' cognitive styles and the depth of their understanding of complex concepts. Standardized tests are frequently used for evaluation and accountability purposes. They frequently track students' progress, and they also are looking at how effective teachers are and how effective individual schools are, because they can track learning outcomes. For example, districts and states use tests to hold educators accountable for students' achievement by evaluating overall gains at the school level. And frequently, parents hold educators accountable by evaluating how their children are doing in comparison with typical children at their grade level. Because hundreds of thousands of children take these standardized tests, you know how your particular child is doing relative to a child in Wisconsin or a child in California. It's not just a local test. When we talk about standardized tests, we talk broadly about three different types. Aptitude tests, such as IQ tests and others, predict students' abilities. This is about understanding children's potential, not their achievement. Achievement tests, on the other hand, such as the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, measure students' knowledge and skills in subject areas. So, for example, the Iowa test has a section on reading and has a section on math, and is designed to measure what they've achieved in those subjects, what they've learned. And finally, diagnostic tests focus on specific subject matter to discover student strengths or weaknesses. As we said, aptitude tests focus on general learning potential, and a lot of them tend to be things like IQ tests, which I provided a list there for you of some common IQ tests: Stanford Binet, Wechsler, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children known as the WISC, and you can read the rest there. All of these are aptitude tests. These IQ tests measure a student's general aptitude or potential for school learning. They do not measure what the student has achieved in content knowledge. Achievement tests measure a student's knowledge and skill level in particular subject areas. And generally, they break out into two types, which we've discussed a little bit before: norm-referenced achievement tests. And this is, if you recall, involves comparing students to other students, big groups of students, to see where they are on the normal curve. And criterion-referenced achievement tests that involve comparing students' knowledge on standards. How are standardized tests interpreted? Well, after the students take a standardized test, they're usually sent for computer scoring. The students' raw scores are translated into one or more derived scores. And so when you're looking at the reporting, you're going to see a raw score for the student that doesn't mean that much. And that's why the companies translate them into one of three scores: percentiles, grade equivalents, or standard scores. And we're going to talk about each one of these so you know what you're looking at. A percentile score or percentile rank, and you can see the abbreviation there, indicates the percentage of students in the norming group who scored lower than a particular score. If the norming group, and that's the group of the tens or hundreds of thousands of students that they used at the beginning they gave this test to tens or thousands of students to derive what the normal scores are, and then they plotted a normal curve, and then they see where the students who are taking the test compare against that normal curve. If that's a national sample, it's called a national percentile score. So you might sometimes see that. If you see national percentile score, know that that standardized test was normed on a national sample of students. For example, if a student scores in the 61st percentile, this means that 61% of students in the norming group scored lower than him. Or to put it another way, he scored higher than 61% of those students. It is not a grade, so don't think in terms of a grading scale, which is, when you take a course and you get a 61, that would generally translate to a D. It's not that. You have to think about, so if you scored 70 in the 75th percentile, you scored 75%, higher than 75% of the students. If you scored in the 90th percentile, you scored higher than 90% of the students in that original norming samples. Grade equivalent scores are sometimes used. These scores relate student scores to other scores of students at the same grade level. They're easy to interpret and they make intuitive sense, but they're only a rough approximation. So for example, you might have a situation on a standardized reading test where a third grade student scores at a grade equivalent of fifth grade. That means that third grade student is reading where most fifth grade students would be reading. Sometimes they even add decimal points to the grade equivalent scores. So 5.3, for example, would usually mean the third month of fifth grade. Standard scores sound a little scary because they involve statistics, but they're actually pretty simple. They describe student scores based on their position on the normal curve, and they're often reported in stanines. So think of stanines as numbers 1 to 9, and the average stanine for the average student is 5, and they're easy to record and use, and they're related to the percentile ranks. Let me show you what I mean. So it's possible to have stanines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In looking at this list, you can see at the bottom a stanine of 1 would translate to a percentile rank below 4. So that's pretty low. That means if the child is in a stanine 1, it means that the best he could have done would be to score better than only 4% of the students who were in the norming sample. A stanine 2 means a percentile rank of 4 to 10. So if I scored in the 9th percentile, better than 9% of students in the norming sample, I'd be at a stanine level 2. And so forth. You can go all the way up to 9. If you're in a stanine 9, it means you got at least a 96th percentile. You scored better than 96% of the students in the norming sample. And so stanines are just a quick, easy, think of them like bins for percentile ranks. So you can see a 5 is average, and it goes up to a 9, and it goes down to a 1. There are some issues with standardized testing. Standardized testing has increased dramatically in recent years. All states now have statewide testing programs in which students at selected grade levels take state tests. But in recent years, there have been many developments and proposals for changes in testing. So one of the issues with standardized testing is the validity. Do the tests measure actually what they say they will measure? We ran into this situation in our teacher preparation tests in New York State. Some of you may recall that there was a teacher certification test called the Academic Literacy Skill Test, or the ALST, and the state had to do away with that because it really wasn't a valid test. It required that you write persuasively, a persuasive essay, but that's not really what's aligned with being a good teacher, so it wasn't necessarily the most valid test. Reliability. Do tests measure the same thing the same way again and again? This is why they do such extensive testing on some of these larger achievement and aptitude tests particularly. They know the role of test anxiety can affect reliability, for example. And then one concern that has been raised is test bias. Perhaps some of these tests might be biased against students from low-income backgrounds or against students from different cultural backgrounds. For example, I used to administer a test called the KBIT, the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test. It took about 15 minutes, and it was a screening test that functioned almost like an IQ test. And we would pull students out from class and administer that test before we did the full IQ test. But what I noticed on that test is that it wanted very specific answers to certain, for example, vocabulary items that students from certain backgrounds may not have had exposure to. For example, in the rural South, we grew up calling uh, wall outlets plugs, but a student was penalized if he called this wall outlet a plug because you were just supposed to know it was a wall outlet. And so it wasn't really as valid as it should have been because it was penalizing students from those backgrounds. One of the things that computers have added to standardized testing is that they've become computer adapted. And so if you've ever taken a standardized test and you sat down and the more questions you were asked, the harder the questions got, you might have taken a computer adapted test. And the way that works is students will answer a question correct and get another answer that's slightly harder, and they'll answer that correct. They'll get another answer that's slightly harder, The more they answer, the more questions they get. If they start answering a lot incorrectly, they'll get fewer questions and the questions will be easier. So the computer kind of targets what question you get based on your proficiency level. As with other tests, we can expect to see testing accommodations in these big standardized test settings. Some types of accommodations, such as enlarging text for students with visual problems, is not controversial. Other kinds are a little more controversial, such as accommodations for students with learning disabilities that include extended time and reading aloud. It may surprise you to hear that a number of these standardized tests offer accommodations. Usually they have to be arranged in advance and well documented. Standardized tests sometimes allow for accommodations for ESL students, students who cannot speak English and so therefore cannot respond meaningfully to tests in English. Some of those accommodations might include rewritten tests to simplify instructions or items, providing extra time to give the student time to decode, or presenting two tests in two languages at the same time. Teachers always think about tests as being equated with accountability. So, how are teachers held accountable for student achievement through these tests? Well, you may have sensed over the years a growing trend in holding all teachers, schools, and districts accountable for what students learn. And so many times policymakers turn to standardized tests because they hold the best, they offer us the best shot of student learning across large areas or grade levels in a uniform way. Consequently, all U.S. states, most Canadian provinces, England, and a number of other countries have implemented regular standardized testing programs, and they often publish these results on a school by school basis. Principals and other administrators watch these scores the way business owners watch profit sheets. So they want to see their scores going up or at a consistently high mark. Standardized tests have thus become high-stakes tests, and their results have serious consequences for educators and students. Sometimes these consequences involve jobs or funding or other consequences, college entrance, for example, for students. Let's take a brief look at a history and progression of testing in the United States. Testing really came in big time with the provision of the No Child Left Behind law, which was implemented during the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s. At that time, all states started to implement testing in reading and math, and the law allowed for disaggregated or separate reporting by school for different subgroups for example, by ethnicity. So there would be reports broken out to show the progress of Black students or Hispanic students or white students. For impoverished students, uh, students, for example, on free and reduced lunch, how were they doing? For ELLs, for special ed students. And the point here, as the name implied, was that some of these students were falling behind. So we had to test them in order to track how they were doing year upon year upon year. All schools were expected to make what was called adequate yearly progress, or AYP, and the states defined, excuse me, what this AYP consisted of. So they could actually talk about the percentage increase they wanted to see in their schools in achievement, for example. Funding and even school closures were tied to making AYP. So, for example, if a school didn't hit their targets in AYP for 3 years in a row, usually the state would send in money, usually provided by the federal government. Part of that was provided by the feds, and try to improve the school. And then if it didn't improve over time, they would shut the school. During the Obama administration in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act was replaced No Child Left Behind, and that act basically stripped the NCLB the role of the federal government and turned much of it over to the states. So students continue to take standardized tests in certain grades. It's heavy in grades 3 to 8 and 11 to 12. But in this act, states have more power in determining which standards should be assessed. And a big change, students with disability were now assessed using mostly the same tests as other students, whereas No Child Left Behind had allowed for some flexibility in testing students with disability. States also now had to determine consequences and how low performing schools would be supported. Betsy DeVos, who is President Trump's Secretary of State of Secretary of Education, had to approve states' plans for the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and as of this lecture, has now approved all 50 state plans. So you're still going to see a lot of testing. You're still going to see a lot of accountability. States have more say in this testing now and how it gets implemented. The Common Core standards, which you've heard a lot about, are probably, if you're working in a school, you're working with the Common Core standards, were rolled out in 2010, and some versions have, excuse me, since been adopted by 42 of the 50 states. These assessments started rolling out around 2014 and 2015, and they're primarily focused on reading and math. Their purpose is to have all U.S. students work towards similar objectives and standard criteria for proficiency. So that kind of makes sense because if every state, which they were doing before, is measuring a different set of standards, we don't know how students are doing nationwide on certain important standards like in math and in reading. But the Common Core standards have been an attempt to try to standardize some of those standards. So we know, for example, how a student in New York compares in multiplication standards with a student in Alabama or a student in California. The Common Core state standards, abbreviated CCSS, also tend to encourage more writing, more in-depth analysis, argumentation, reasoning, and the use of technology. Lately, there has been a great emphasis on data-driven instruction that's coming out of this standardized testing. And this emphasis on testing and accountability has led to educators using data to drive instruction. So what that means is you don't just go into your classroom and teach and not pay attention to some of the data that you're required to collect and report to the school level and the district level. You'll probably be working with a defined set of standards, learning objectives, and targets that are given to you through your administration that come usually from the district or even the state. You may work to benchmarks, and now these are subject benchmarks. They're usually found in your textbooks, usually in reading and math, although there are others in science and social studies. And these are benchmarks that are related to the state standards that you're going to be asked to assess throughout the year. A lot of times, this assessment might look like a curricular test, for example, um, and it's, again, primarily predominant in reading and math. Data-driven instruction is also an emphasis of teacher or school evaluation systems. So this is where you are evaluated as a teacher through a number of standardized systems. And one of the predominant types of evaluation systems that are in use now emphasizes value added. So what they'll do is they'll see where the students that you had were at in their standardized testing last year, and Grade level equivalents, if you remember what we talked about earlier in the lecture, are particularly useful here. So they might say, okay, you have 20 students, and out of the 20, they were predominantly, if you're a 7th grade teacher, all in the 7th grade level range on their standardized testing. By the end of the year, have you brought them up to an 8th grade level? And so have you added the value of a full year of academic progress? And that's what value-added systems concentrate on, comparing where students were in their standardized tests last year to where they are this year. As a consequence of all this data, we have a data-driven reform effort going on in the United States. And what this does is it's looking beyond student scores on state tests, school leaders looking at this data to drive reform in all kinds of different ways. So, for example, they might, administrators at the district level or at the school level might look across skill sets and say our students are weak in reading comprehension. They might be looking at subgroups. They might be saying our Hispanic students need more support in reading, for example. They might look by grade levels and say, oh, okay, our 3rd graders need particular help in conceptualizing multiplication and division. And so they start to put reforms into place, curricular reforms. Sometimes it can cause administrators to move teachers around to areas where they think their strengths would benefit whatever's going on. In addition to scores, they're looking at other types of data. For example, school attendance patterns to see when students are and are not in school. Do dropout programs help in dropout situations? And so all of this information, all of these data add information to find the root causes of school problems. When you're conducting data-driven reform, you go through a series of steps. You determine what you want to know at the school level, the district level. You decide what data you need to collect from that, and you collect the data. You analyze the results. You set some goals based on your analysis of how you could improve things, and develop and implement specific strategies. Collect data on those strategies, analyze those results, etc. It's kind of a loop. You keep trying to improve as you go through the year. That's the end of this lecture and the end of the course, except for the final exam. Congratulations, you made it through. Remember that the final is due by December 21st. I want to thank you for allowing me to be your professor. Even though we haven't met face to face, I feel like I know many of you. I hope you've all learned a lot. I know I learned from every class. And I want to wish you luck in your future as a teacher. I'm proud of all of you. So goodbye and safe travels. And don't forget to complete the blue survey, please. Thank you.